Revolutionary greetings to the Commander-in-Chief, commissars, fighters, and everyone watching this video today from all corners of the world. Again, my name is Piwaba Madokwe. I'm a member of the Central Command team of the Economic Freedom Fighters, and I would like to welcome all of you to lecture number 7 of the EFF Book Club, wherein we'll be going through Dr. Kwame Nkrumah's Africa Must Unite. Before I start with my lecture, we would like to extend our condolences to all those who have lost their loved ones to the COVID-19 pandemic. We'd like to thank South Africans for holding maximum discipline during this difficult time. And we also encourage them to adhere to all lockdown regulations so that we are in a situation or we are able to flatten the curve and we are able to combat this pandemic. With that being said, we'll be starting with, I'll go through the introduction of the author, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Thereafter, I'll just do a quick outline of the book and then take questions. It must also be noted that most of the questions that we received as the Economic Freedom Fighters prior to this lecture have actually been incorporated into the lecture. However, if we do get extra time, we'll then be looking at the questions that were given in the comment section and attend to them. Just back on Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. Dr. Kwame Nkrumah was born on the 21st of September 1909 in the Gold Coast, which is now known as Ghana. He was born as Francis Kofi Nkrumah. He attended a Catholic school and thereafter trained and worked as a teacher. In the early 1930s, he was introduced to anti-colonial resistance movement, and he subsequently went to the United States to further his studies. He spent close to 10 years in the United States and gained various qualifications, including sociology, theology, and philosophy. In the United States, he started off as a student activist where he helped found an African Students Association. And he also remained an advocate for solidarity across the African continent. In 1945, he left the United States for London, and he helped organize the 5th Pan-African Congress in Manchester. He was also active in various structures and initiatives by the Pan-African Congress until he left for Ghana in 1947. In 1952, after his release from imprisonment, he became the Prime Minister of Gold Coast. And then in 1957, he also became the Prime Minister of independent Ghana. In 1960, because now they were in a situation where they could draft their own constitution and had full executive and legislative powers, he was then recognized as the first president of Ghana. He escaped numerous assassination attempts. The first one was on August 1962. In 1964, Ghana became a one-party state with Nkrumah as its president. He was, however, unseated in 1966 through a coup while on a visit to. He subsequently sought refuge in Guinea, where he spent the remainder of his life and died of cancer in 1972. He has written various books, including Africa Must Unite, which is the book that we will be reviewing today. Just on the book has about 21 chapters. I've divided the chapters into categories so that the review is easier and we can cover as much of the content as possible. Chapter 1 to 12 speaks on the colonization of Africa. Chapter 5 speaks on the role of the intellectual vanguard in the liberation of Africa. Chapter 6 to 14 speaks on how Ghana gained independence and its contribution and challenges as the first independent African country. Chapter 15 to 17 speak about the African Unity Project, while chapter 18 to 21 speak about the Africa in relation to the global community. We'll also be looking at some of the EFF's policy positions, which are in line with some of the ideas that are in the book time allowing. As we said, we are aiming for a 1 hour session, so here goes. I will start with chapter 1 to 4, which also makes reference to chapter 5. These chapters give readers an overview of Africa before and during colonialism, including the effects of colonialism after independence and capitalism as well. There had been long-standing myths and propaganda spearheaded by our colonizers that before they came to our shores, Africa was a dark continent, Africans were uncivilized, Africans lived with trees and they were animal skins and all types of ridiculous states. Such narratives did not end in the 15th century when the first recorded colonizers hit our shores, nor did they end in the 19th century when colonizing countries tried to justify dividing Africa among themselves. But these comments or these propaganda are often known to this day by arrogant racist descendants of colonizers in our online platforms and on social media. We even have political leaders, the likes of Helen Zille, who to this day believe that colonialism had some benefits for Africans. To date, there has been no cogent political program or political will to educate Black people about the real history of Africa, so as to clean up the brainwashing that colonizers had on our people. Chapter 1 describes some parts of pre-colonial Africa as already having flourishing states and empires, having cities, some better than most of the cities that were in Europe. It speaks about wealthy kingdoms. It speaks about Africa already having centers of trade. It speaks about an Africa that was not tolerant to crime. And also that Africa had at that time, which was the 15th century, intellectual centers such as Timbuktu, which provided the world with world-class scholars and knowledge. The author also makes reference to a journal entry by Vasco da Gama, wherein he makes reference to him and his traders meeting with 2 African traders. And then in their interaction with those African traders, number one, the African traders were not interested in anything that Vasco da Gama and his people had to offer them, which therefore means that the products that Africans had at that time were advanced. Second, he also makes reference to the fashion that they were wearing caps with silk and embroidery and all sorts of things. And thirdly, he also says that in interacting with some people that were in that country, that he found out that there had been ships before his that have been coming to Africa. This, therefore, it serves as evidence that before colonizers supposedly discovered us, Africa was already having trade relations with other parts of the world. The chapters also touch on the effects of slavery, wherein millions of Africans were taken away from the continent. It also touches on the effects of displacement, wherein millions of Africans ran across the continent seeking refuge from colonizers or had nowhere else to go because colonizers had destroyed their homes. This displacement of Africans has resulted in even us South Africans having ancestry or tracing our roots to the northern parts of Africa. However, our lack of knowledge about our past and our religion and our origins is what has made it extremely easy to hate our African brothers and sisters who find themselves in the same situation our ancestors found themselves in centuries ago. Another important lesson from the first chapter is the outline of the conquest of Africa, which is commonly known as the Scramble for Africa. The Scramble for Africa was not just about dividing colonies and creating borders, but it was also about the direct ownership of Africa by the colonizing colonies. It was about the ownership of Africa's people, its mineral resources, its harbors, its rivers, its forests, its fields, etc. Post-independence of Ghana in 1957, post our own country's independence in 1994, can we confidently say that now, as Africans, we have our continent back? Can we confidently say that we have taken back everything that colonizers have taken from us? If that is not the case, what are we doing as a continent to claim Africa back to its people? As colonizers seized Africa and cut up territories, their borders and territorial boundaries, they cut across tribes and villages, they destroyed communities and separated families. These colonial borders to this day serve as a barrier for Africans to see that they are more alike than different. Secondly, if we accept that borders were inventions of colonizers solely for marking their territories and dividing Africa to suit their interests, what do these borders serve post-independence and towards the liberation project, which does not only look at individual countries attaining freedom, but the entire continent as a whole? The second chapter speaks about the various colonial and governance systems that were in place in Africa and how each colonizing country presiding over its colonies as it saw fit. The variation in governance resulted in countries that colonized us trying to make us think that there was a better devil among them. You'd hear things such as the British were better masters than the French were better than the Belgians, and so on. But this should never be taken to heart by Africans. To Africans, all the colonized, all colonizers are the same, including beneficiaries of colonialism in the West and in Africa to date. Our treatment as the other, as subhumans, as exploitable labor, or as slaves was the same for all Africans, whether in Kenya, whether you were in Ghana, whether you were in Nigeria, or whether you were in South Africa. Chapter 2 of the book outlines how different governments ruled over their countries, as I've explained above, but I will expand on the French assimilation method. The French, they ruled over the largest territory of Africa, and they introduced their colonies to the assimilation method with the aim of introducing an elite class. So what they were aiming to do is that by creating this elite class, then they would be able to avoid the rise of African nationalism in their territories, because this elite class would be given Frenchman status. The class elites, however, remained very small, and outside of it, the vast majority of blacks remained marginalized and poor. Apartheid and post-apartheid South Africa went for a similar method and established what we now call the black middle class for basically the same purpose. In political circles, we call those from these groups the clever bags. We know how problematic these people are. In reference to South Africa, in an interview in 1972, Black consciousness leader Steve Biko said that if the nationalists were intelligent, remember at this time, South Africa did not have a black middle class, which therefore means it did not have a fully fledged capitalist society. So what he then said was that if the nationalists were intelligent, they would establish a capitalist black society and a black middle class. And this establishment would be very effective in putting a point across the world that South Africa was integrated and that there was improvement. But that was not going to be the case, because although there was this middle class that was going to be paraded and all these black successful people, over 70% of the population would still remain underdogs. The EFF Founding Manifesto makes reference to the mirage that is the black middle class, and that the living conditions of the black majority in South Africa have not changed fundamentally post-apartheid. That we are still landless, we are still poor, we are still unemployed, and we are excluded from the economy of this country. These issues, by the way, are not exclusive to South Africa, but they are there in most so-called African states. The period of the COVID-19 pandemic, although filled with lots of uncertainty and a few strides here and there, has exposed the failure of African governments to create systems where its people can survive without depending on foreign aid or government grants. It has also exposed the implications of us not owning our economy, of not ensuring that our resources work for uplifting our people. It also has exposed the implications of the failure of our governments or their refusal to create or protect local production of food, and lacking the imagination to create local industries wherein we would be able to process our raw materials for the purpose of, number one, serving our needs, and secondly, to trade with the world so that we are then able to create our own revenue. The EFF has also made suggestion that there must be a sovereign wealth fund where all these profits that we are making from our raw materials are kept, primarily so that they can be able to assist our countries or our countrymen. Various experts have said that the COVID-19 stats are the calm before the storm. As Africans, what are we doing to ensure that when the storm comes, we are able to prevail? Dynamics at an international level have shown that it's every man for themselves, and that the West will not hesitate to, number one, prioritize its people, or to even abuse Africa to reach that end. The utterances by the two French rock doctors are a snippet into how even the most educated white people in the world over still harbor a superior complex over Africans. The reports of abuse of Africans in China is also another example that we are on our own. Even at the crux of a global pandemic, racism is still headstrong. Africans the world over are still the underdog, the punching bag, the doormat. So what are we waiting for? If our Africanity or blackness is enough to render us permanent underdogs in every corner of the world, why is it not the basis on which we unite and forge alliances against forces that are anti-progress? Our colonizers took land and subjected Africans to exorbitant taxes so they would have to leave home and go work for meager wages. These wages were not so that Africans could thrive and build themselves, but it was so that they could be cushioned from starvation and be able to commute to work. Africans were deliberately subjected to landlessness and as exploitable labor. They were always at the mercy of colonial governments. Not much has changed for the average Black person to this day, even though we are told that we are liberated, we are a developing country, and so forth. Imagine our relations with governments if we had learned, if we were economically active and were educated. Would our governments in Africa as well operate with the same level of arrogance they operate today? Why has there been no political program aimed at massive industrial development and bridging the gap between rich and poor in South Africa or in Africa? It is because we are still led by people who have inherited colonizer governance systems, worship them, and refuse to transform them so that our people could be liberated. The EFF Cardinal Pillar number 5 speaks on what it means for us to, for massive industrial development and so forth. Our 2019 elections manifesto also speaks to the establishment of economic zones in strategic areas and various other initiatives that could create jobs and uplift our economy. The suggestions that the EFF makes are not just there, but they also come with timelines, and they also come with suggestions as to how we will fund these initiatives. Perhaps we must also be able to ask ourselves, why is it that provinces such as the Eastern Cape, KZN, Limpopo, Northwest, Northern Cape, and so forth, have little or no development and have little or no economic activity, such that South Africans from those parts are forced to hop from one province to another in search of greener pastures? Yet these provinces have the same potential as other provinces who have thriving economies. Almost 26 years later, why are we still keeping colonial economic patterns in place? This chapter also makes an important point about how, after having witnessed the atrocities meted on their people, African countries started to mobilize themselves, and how, having attained their freedom, they consolidated themselves behind an African approach to liberate South Africa. Remember, we only got our independence in 1984, while some African countries got their independence as early as the 1950s and the 1960s. And the author also indicates that the West had at one point realized that they were losing grip of the African continent, as Africans were starting to revolt in different parts of the continent. Most of these colonizers' countries, we have now come to realize that they never really left Africa and are still pulling the strings from where they are. They dictate our governments, they dictate our policies, and so forth. And when they can no longer control the people who are leading, they start wars and continue exploiting our resources and killing our people under the guise of peacekeeping. If we take a look at most Africans who took up powerful positions as presidents, as lawmakers, and as parliamentarians after independence, we can see that most of those leaders were opposed on us, so as to continue facilitating the conquest of Africa on behalf of colonizers to this day. Those who vehemently oppose European influence in African affairs post-independence, and those who had the well-being of Africa at heart, were either mercilessly killed, removed through coups, or erased from history books, and the very people who they spent their lives fighting for were turned against them. The likes of Kwame Nkrumah, Patrice Lumumba, Chris Hani, Steve Biko, Mama Winnie Mandela, to mention a few. We must also check the education accolades of African leaders post-independence. Who gave them their education and what were they being prepared for? And if we are aware that the West has no intention of letting go of Africa and keeps reproducing an intelligentsia whose primary purpose is to help these colonial countries entrench their colonial interests, why have African governments not created an education system that counters this setup? What are we being prepared for through our education system as so-called born frees? What are the 2000s, so-called 2000s, also benefiting? What does our education system really prepare us for? The EFF Student Command founding manifesto makes a cogent outline of what an ideal African education system should look like, and even makes proposals on realistic steps that can be taken to achieve this. Chapter 5 of Africa Must Unite touches upon what should be the role of African intelligentsia or the liberation discourse, and that it is to become the vanguard of the struggle against alien rule. Over and above that, Nkrumah emphasized the need for African countries to establish an education system in line with the economic and social progress of the post-colonial government's independent plans. 26 years into our democracy, is this happening? If the ultimate plan of the liberation movements in Africa were to fully liberate its people and reclaim Africa from its colonizers, what evidences this? Back to the role of intelligentsia. Africans have always had the desire to be educated. However, colonial governments, including current sitting governments, have refused to invest in the education of Africans. The burning desire for education has been evidenced by the conversations and mass actions undertaken by South African youth between 2015 and 2016 under the Fees Must Fall movement. Demonstrations that were there before and are there to date, calling for fee-free education and decolonization of the academic spaces. Does it not make you wonder, though, that some response, although unsatisfactory, was given on the part of free education, but demands made by thousands of students across the country for the curriculum and the academic space to be decolonized have been blue-ticked to this day? Africa Must Unite brings to the fore the argument and belief by colonizers that African resources were useless to Africans until the intervention of Europeans who developed and skilled us. The author also makes various arguments that poke holes on this baseless argument. He even makes an analogy of a man who found treasure buried in his neighbor's garden, stole it, and maintained he'd done his neighbor no harm because the neighbor did not know about the treasure, and for that matter, did not have a spade to dig. The author dispels the long-standing propaganda by Europeans that they came to Africa to civilize it, or that Africa had become a burden to the West, by quoting some high-ranking politicians from the West who in their meetings boasted about their conquest of the continent. One politician, for example, argued that after European had achieved industrialization, it needed to extend its markets. For that to happen, they had to colonize Africa so that they could get raw materials for free and labor to export. Furthermore, these colonies, which they termed lucrative investment deals, would be consumers of the finished products. Another politician further exclaimed that colonization was an act of force motivated by self-interest and a one-sided and egotistical imposition of the strong upon the weak. To conclude this section on colonialism in Africa, the author outlined how capital has created various monopolies which influence economies, and how capital has created a platform where such monopolies have consolidated at an international level and shared the world among themselves, the very same ways that countries divided Africa among themselves during the Berlin Conference. One can even argue that globalization, which was a buzzword post-independence and so highly appraised by African leaders as the main development route, is in fact repackaged colonialism. How capitalism manifested itself in Africa and its effects are touched on and were touched on by previous lectures, and therefore there's no need for me to elaborate on that. Now we are on chapter 14, which speaks on how Ghana gained independence and its role and challenges as an independent African country. Ghana was the first African country to gain its independence in 1957, and its president, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah, believed that Ghana's independence was futile without the independence of the African continent. Familiarizing ourselves with how Ghana consolidated its independence and what role it played thereafter is important to us as activists, as Africans, and anyone who is interested in an African prosperity and the concept of unity. In chapter 6, the author makes the emphasis for the need for Ghana and African countries to gain independence by liberating the people and getting the people involved in every step of the way in the liberation project before moving towards development. How Latin American countries have, against all odds, defied the odds that have been put against them, is a classic example of the end result of this approach and why it is important. Latin Americans are so loyal to their attained freedom, are so patriotic, and constantly side with their leaders and socialist ideals despite being bullied and starved, and all the sanctions and propaganda the West has used against them. Nkrumah also makes mention of the formation of African national organizations as early as the 1940s, with the intention to consolidate Africans and towards improvement of economic and social conditions. Emphasis is also made that the guaranteed success of the liberation project depended on the strength of a well-organized political party, which is representative of the majority of the masses. It is against this backdrop and a similar call by Lenin of the need to establish a political vanguard that the EFF was formed. The importance of sovereignty and the domestic challenges faced by the Convention People's Party, which is the party that won Ghana and helped Nkrumah become president, when it assumed power, were outlined. Sovereignty meant countries had total control over decision-making and running of the country, including compilation of its constitution. South Africa is said to have the best constitution in the world. But did all the clauses have the African majority in mind? Let's take the current conversation on the amendment of Section 25 to allow for the expropriation of land without compensation for equal distribution, for example. Whose interest did the current clause serve? And why are there so many delays in amending this section? Let us take a look at the hundreds of apartheid legislations and laws that the ANC government refuses to amend or throw to the dustbin to date, including the Riotous Act used to charge the Commander-in-Chief and by extension the EFF for calling people to take up land. Whose interest does a liberation movement that still cherishes apartheid laws serve? The refusal to rename cities and streets named after murderous colonizers, the refusal to heed the call to remove apartheid statues such that Parliament itself is surrounded by big statues of colonizers. What does this tell us about our liberation movement? What does the total disregard of the Constitution or clauses that enforce human rights violations tell us about the caliber of liberation movements we have in other African countries? Whose interests do these governments serve? And if not of our people, can we then claim to be liberated? And is that not reason enough for Africans to forge unity? Towards consolidating independence and socialism, Nkrumah makes an emphasis on the need for leaders of African liberation movements to prioritize early selection and training of their future executive officers. As alluded to earlier, colonial governments made no efforts to educate the natives. As a result, when Ghana gained independence, they had problems in terms of executing their duties and facilitating the inclusion of the African majority in the socio-economic activities of the country through administrative processes, because they did not have enough trained administrators, technicians, or treasurers, which were crucial in achieving this. Eventually, Ghana established their civil service. It is not by mistake that the EFF has since inception emphasized on the need for all to get an education, and the leadership of the EFF making education fashionable through various academic ventures. The EFF has also made it compulsory for its public representatives to attain formal qualifications. Not only has the EFF made these leaps internally, but it is the only political party that showed unwavering support for the call for free decolonized education through various interventions. South Africans have also been encouraged to familiarize themselves and part of decision-making or skill development programs in their communities. This knowledge meant we will need not only to run South Africa, but the rest of the continent as well. Putting emphasis on people getting education, however, does not disregard the socio-economic factors that bar our people from getting an education, nor does it disregard the contribution of South Africans in the building of this country merely because they do not have a formal education. Another important ingredient to ushering national development and good governance is the need for economic development. Chapter 13 of Africa Must Unite speaks on the road towards economic development initiatives taken by Ghana to achieve this. What departments and structures were established and what their functions were. How can South Africa reach economic independence? The EFF also in its 2019 elections manifesto makes a case on practical steps that could be taken with timelines and funding proposals for each initiative. What South Africa lacks is government with clear conscience and political will. They keep shifting goalposts and keep speaking about an imaginary young democracy. How is 26 years young? How long did it take Ghana or the likes of Burkina Faso to implement pro-people policies before they were removed, their presidents were removed through coups? How are we overtaken by Rwanda, which when we were ushered into democracy, they had to deal with violent genocide and the effects of that genocide years after? Take a look at the laws applied by the apartheid government after 1948. How long did it take for those laws to be implemented? And what was the result of such laws over what period of time? Chapter 14 makes emphasis that at the core of its liberation and government's agenda, there were study groups in every corner of the country. These initiatives focused on teaching government officials, workers, and ordinary citizens alike on African life and culture, party ideology, decisions and programs, and explaining government policies and actions. South Africa, 26 years later, still has no plan to usher patriotism or sovereignty. We are still a fragmented society that is at random times united by pop culture, social media, or tragedy. Even sports, which was at one point glued us together, it does not do that anymore. If we were to even ask 10 random people what makes them proudly South African, you would see what I'm talking about. Now we are off to chapter 15 to 17. Chapter 15 to 17 speaks on the African Unity Project and lessons thereof. These chapters outline the African Unity Project, and the author starts by making a point that although division existed in the African continent, our reasons for unity far outweigh those that divide us. He further alludes that these reasons are far deeper than our colonial past or our common aims for independence. A brief history of the Pan-Africanist movement, its contribution in planting the seed for unity among Africans, and the role played by Kwame Nkrumah, who is acknowledged as one of the first founding fathers of Africanism in the African continent, is made. Pan-Africanism served as both a cultural and political ideology for the solidarity of people of African descent, with the primary aim of understanding the primary injustices against Africans in the diaspora. However, it later turned into an advocacy for socio-economic, political, and psychological independence of those under colonial or neo-colonial regimes. Pan-Africanism also emphasized on the need for national independence, which would lead to African unity and which would equip African countries to assist each other in liberating the rest of the African countries. Nkrumah also makes reference to the challenges faced by Congo after attaining its independence, as colonizers would not retreat without a fight, such that they sought assistance from the United Nations. Nkrumah strongly believes that had the United Nations acted on time, it could have helped maintain the sovereignty of Lumumba's government. He also makes an important case that had independent states of Africa been united to start with, or at least had a joint military command and a common foreign policy, an African solution would have been found for Congo and would have been saying something different about Congo today. Present-day United States of Africa would have helped the likes of Zimbabwe protect its liberation against and also Libya as well. The modern-day slave trade in Morocco would not have gone unnoticed. Conflicts in countries such as Sudan would have been resolved, and the West-sponsored conflicts in countries such as Congo and the continued stealing of her resources would have been stopped. Various attempts have been made to establish a United States of Africa as early as the 1950s, but various challenges arose, some of which are evident in how even the African Union, which has been established or was established in 2002, has been reduced to a toothless, visionless structure with no strong political leadership. We must also take it into consideration that the African Union was actually a watered-down version of Nkrumah's vision for a united Africa. The elevation of current sitting South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who has plunged South Africa into darkness within a few months, says a lot about the trajectory of the African Union from this point onwards. Many African countries ridiculed the call for a United States of Africa, and some even said the vision was impossible. However, there existed many such arrangements in other parts of the world, and the book makes detailed reference to some of these, including the United States of America, Canada, the USSR, Australia, Switzerland, Venezuela, to name a few. Now, fast forward to 1993. European countries took the same idea of a United States of Africa and they established the European Union. And for the same reason, for greater unity, for collective benefit, and for providing global leadership. Since then, Asian and American states have also united, notwithstanding challenges. And if you look at how all these states, after they created these unions, have actually thrived and have been able to position themselves as global superpowers, should tell you something about what would be the benefits of having a United States of Africa. The African Union was established in 1999, but with less radical objectives to the original founding principles of the Pan-African Congress. The body as it stands has an Agenda 2063, which means that the people who are sitting in that structure currently will be dead mostly in the next 10 years or in the next 20 years, and they will not be leading the African Union. They will not be held accountable for any of the deadlines that they have established. And the fact that one at this point in time looks at establishing deadlines that are over 40 years from now shows that the liberation and the unity of African continent is not seen as urgent or long overdue by the people that sit in the African Union. Delays in the establishment of a strong United States of Africa has given all colonizers, including new exploiters, leeway to suck off as much as possible while westernizing Africa through globalization. The African Union and its leaders have placed themselves as beggars to people who continue exploiting our countries.